In the fall of 1904, a politician named Sir Rodmond Roblin stood in front of the legislative building in the Manitoba capital of Winnipeg, and he unveiled this statue of Queen Victoria. Looking back on it now, we can only say it must have seemed like a really good idea at the time. Not only a really good idea, but an obviously good idea. Victoria had at that time reigned longer than any other British monarch, 63 years and 7 months. She had presided over this time of incredible change throughout her country and her empire. There'd been change in the political world, in the way the military was organized. There was change, great industrial advances and scientific advances. And throughout all of that, her steady hand had seen the empire not only survive, but also grow, so that the sun would never set over it. She was only 3 years gone when Roblin unveiled that statue that seemed like such a good idea. About 117 years later, on Canada Day 2021, the statue would be torn down. The queen in the statue holds an orb, this typically European symbol of power, and it was wrenched from her hands and never recovered. The statue's head was separated from its body and later recovered in the nearby Assiniboine River. And despite the chaos of that day, one bystander could only remark on her indifference. She said this: "She, the queen, means nothing to me except that her policies and her colonialism is what is dictating to us right to this minute as we speak." The scene is not an unfamiliar one. It played itself out in the United States as statues of Confederate leaders and slave owners were torn down. It played itself out in the UK, in the city of Bristol, where a statue of a wealthy and famed slave trader was torn from its foundation and thrown into the city's harbor. It happened all over the place. And the debates and the events themselves, they say something about the way that we view the world. There must be good guys and bad guys, and there's very little space in between. These statues, they either need to be toppled and torn down, or they need to be defended tooth and nail. It must be one or the other. But what if it's more complicated than that? What if our heroes, the people who accomplish great things, the people that we make statues of them, have a little bit of the villain in them? Almost always. And what if the people we label as villains, sometimes they're a little bit more noble than we think? How would we navigate a world like that? And what if that's not just true of the world, but that's true of us as well, that dividing line between good and evil, between hero and villain, it runs right through our very own souls. How would we navigate a world like that if we are people like that? The first bit of the answer, I think, to that question of how do we navigate a complex world is that we navigate it honestly. Throughout this fall and winter, we have together as a church been tracing our fingers along the storyline of this ancient king, Solomon. And if you're familiar with him at all, even in passing, if he's just kind of this figure you think you've maybe kind of heard about, you recognize in Solomon the kind of guy that gets statues built. You've maybe heard of his wealth, or the prosperity of his empire, or the comfort that people lived in his day, or his incredible wisdom that drew people from all around just to hear what he had to say about, well, just about everything. You knew Solomon was a hero. And as we've been following his storyline in the Bible, we find sometimes that the author of the story, he echoes that sentiment, that Solomon is a hero. He's the kind of guy that we should build statues of. And then at the very next moment, the author of the story, well, it seems almost like he's fixing the ropes to the base of the statue, and he's ready to tear it down and cast it into the nearest body of water. He's ready to be done with it. The author of the story, he's really, really honest about Solomon. And as he's being so honest about Solomon, he makes something important really clear to us, that a king who is great and wise can also be weak and foolish. Let me say it to you again, just so that it sinks in. A king who is great and wise can also be weak and foolish. And I think that that's not only true of kings. It's not only true of the kind of people that we build statues of, it's true of us as well. That we can be great and wise, and in the very next moment, or maybe sometimes even in the same moment, we can be weak and foolish. So let's return to what we've been doing, and I want to read to you a long chunk of the book of Kings as Solomon's reign begins to wind down. It's found in the book of 1 Kings in chapter 11. I'm going to pick the story up in verse 9 and read all the way to the end of the chapter. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my commandments and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom. Earlier, when David was fighting with Edom, Joab, the commander of the army, had gone up to bury the dead, and he had struck down all the men in Edom. Joab and all the Israelites stayed there for 6 months until they had destroyed all the men in Edom. But Hadad, still only a boy, fled to Egypt with some Edomite officials who had served his father. They set out from Midian and went to Paran. Then, taking men from Paran with them, they went to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave Hadad a house and land and provided him with food. Pharaoh was so pleased with Hadad that he gave him his sister as the sister of his own wife, Queen Tahpenes, in marriage. The sister of Tahpenes bore him a son named Genubath, whom Tahpenes brought up in the royal palace. There Genubath lived with Pharaoh's own children. While he was in Egypt, Hadad heard that David rested with his fathers and that Joab, the commander of the army, was also dead. Then Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me go that I may return to my own country." "What have you lacked here that you want to go back to your own country?" Pharaoh replied. "Nothing," Hadad answered, "but do let me go." And God raised up against Solomon another adversary, Rezon, son of Eliada, who had fled from his master, Hadadezer, king of Zobah. He gathered men around him and became the leader of a band of rebels. When David destroyed the forces of Zobah, the rebels went to Damascus, where they settled and took control. Rezon was Israel's adversary as long as Solomon lived, adding to the trouble caused by Hadad. So Rezon ruled in Aram and was hostile towards Israel. Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite, from Zeradah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruah. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the supporting terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country. And Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have 1 tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Moloch, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws, as David, Solomon's father, did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of my life for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose, and who observed my statutes and commands. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give 1 tribe to his son, so that David my servant may also always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I choose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel, if you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands, as David my servant did. I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt. So Shishak the king, and he stayed there until Solomon's death. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the Annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king. And so that's it. That's the end of the reign of Solomon. And if you spent time in the book of Kings, you have this sense that as you get to the end of the reign of Solomon, that this is pretty normal. I mean, Solomon was spectacular. He did incredible things. But when it gets to the end, it's pretty much just like every other king. Here's where you can find more information about him. Here's how long he reigned, and he slept with his fathers. By the time it gets to the end, everything is just pretty much the same. It's pretty normal. And maybe that alone should give us pause. This thought that this king, no matter how great he was, he comes to an end that's pretty normal. But the author of Kings, he's not just telling us about the end of Solomon's reign. He's telling us more about how it began to become unraveled. And he tells us of these enemies outside of Solomon's house. There's Rezin and Hadad, these foreign kings who, because of ancient grievances, become enemies throughout the reign of Solomon. And then there's this man named Jeroboam who seems to sit at the head of a rebellion that's happening right within Israel with considerable backing from the northern tribes. At the kingdom from within, it's already facing this tension. And it's tempting, because we know Solomon pretty well at this point, to think that these obstacles are just raised up so that Solomon can solve them. How will the king, who is so wise that he could figure out who a child's mother was just by making the right suggestion? How will the king, who is so wise that the queen came from Sheba just to hear what he had to say, how will he solve these obstacles? But the author of Kings, he's not just raising these obstacles so that Solomon can solve them. He's raising these obstacles to point to a far deeper problem. You see, the real problem isn't this pressure from outside the kingdom in the form of Rezin and Hadad and even Jeroboam. The real problem is the influence that's right within Solomon's own home. The real problem is the influence that is right within Solomon's own home. And that influence, it's powerful enough that it begins to turn Solomon's heart away from God. And it's in that moment that we see this truth that is so often played out in our own lives and in the world around us, that a king who is great and wise can also be weak and foolish. The very same king whom God had appeared to twice, the very same king who had built this magnificent temple, the very same king who at the dedication of that temple can pray, "The Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. May he not leave us or forsake us. May he incline our hearts to him, to walk in all his ways and to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his rules, which he commanded our fathers." This king can have his own heart turn away from God. This king who built the temple, this king who prayed that God would work on his heart so that the leaning of his heart would be towards his God, he can build idols and worship other gods. This very same king who has shown himself to be so great and so wise in this moment is revealed as weak and foolish. You've seen it before, right? The person who you know to be so patient, for some reason, she just erupts. The person who you know to be so unreliable, in the crucial moment, he fails. Or the person who you know to be wise proves foolish. It happens. Jesus actually once told a parable about this. It's in the Gospel according to Luke in chapter 12, and Jesus is approached by a man who has a question, or better, a demand of Jesus. "Teacher," he says to Jesus, "make my brother divide the inheritance with me." And I don't know for certain, but I suspect that before long, the man, he regrets that he asked that question, because Jesus, he doesn't deal with a problem as the man sees it. Instead, Jesus, he deals with the root of the problem. And it's greed, he says. And so the story that Jesus tells, it goes something like this. There was a rich man, and he experienced one of those years in his fields and his farming operation that some of you will know, one of those years when everything is just perfect. And when he looked back on it, the man, he knew, even before he planted his seed, that it was going to be that kind of year, because when he walked his fields, the soil, it just seemed rich and loamy and full of life. And after he planted, he went out and ever so gently with cupped hands, he scraped some of the soil away so that he could see if the seeds were growing. And everywhere he looked, the seeds were stretching roots downwards and shoots upwards. And the rain came on time, and the sun came on time, and the crop, it raced up past his ankles and past his knees. By the time it was bursting into head, he had to walk with his hands stretched out at nearly chest height just to brush against the sticky beards on the long heads of grain. It was perfect. And the man, he dealt with all of this with the humility of a first century farmer. Oh, he knew that he'd gained a lifetime of skill. He knew that he'd done things right in order to make this crop grow, but he also knew that it depended on things far bigger than him, that it was a blessing of God that the crop had grown the way that it had. And he knew that he couldn't count that blessing until it was in the barn. But soon enough, as it does only in perfect years, harvest came and it was perfect. The heaviness of the work was made all the more lighter because it was just so bountiful, and there was so much joy. And there was only one nagging question throughout the harvest season: what do I do with all of this? What do I do with bushel after bushel after bushel? And so one day, shortly after he left the threshing floor, the answer had hit this certain rich man like a bolt of lightning out of thin air. I know. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And that's what he does. And he says to himself, "Self, you have plenty stored up for many years. Eat, drink, and be merry." And in Jesus' story, God speaks to the man, or maybe of the man. He says, "Fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you, and then who will get everything that you've stored up?" One of the things that parable does is that it dismantles our idea of what it is to be foolish. Because a fool and an idiot aren't the same thing. And the man in the story, he's wise in many respects. He knows how to farm. He knows how to manage his crop and to manage his success. But the skill in that area of life, it becomes his undoing, because he forgets the very thing that every person in every time should know: that death can come suddenly and unexpectedly, and that we need to be prepared for that. John Ortberg says of this that foolishness is not a disease of the intellect, that it's a disease of the will. That through our will we choose to live as if there is no God, or live as if we're gods, which is probably the same thing. That the man in the story that Jesus tells, he chooses to live as if there's no God, despite his wisdom and skill in other areas of life. Sound familiar? Sound a little bit like Solomon? Great wisdom and skill in so many areas of life. But that very same wisdom and skill leads him to this point where he thinks, I can live as if there's no God. Or I can live as if I am God, which is the same thing. And so Solomon says, I did the temple, and I dedicated the temple, and now in this area of my life, in my wives and my worship, I will make the choices myself. Thank you very much. It's compartmentalization. And we compartmentalize our lives in a number of ways. We do it spatially. We say, I will give God my Sundays, but not my Mondays to Fridays. I will give God my recreation, but not my family, or my family, but not my job. There are certain areas of my life where I will remain God. I will remain in charge. I'm going to keep things compartmentalized. And maybe if I give God enough, or I give God the little bits and pieces that he wants, then things will turn out okay. But it doesn't work like that. The other way that we compartmentalize is that we compartmentalize temporally. We say, I will give God this piece of time, but not that piece of time. And if we do it like Solomon, we give God this piece of time in the past. We did this great thing back then over there. We built a temple, and now we're okay because we did something great for God. My parents were faithful, and they raised me in the church, so now I'll be okay. I went to Bible school. I went on a missions trip. I did something grand, and so now it'll be okay. I served so faithfully for so long, and now it's time for me to retire and let the younger people do their thing, and I'll just keep the pew warm until my life is demanded of me. But it doesn't work like that. In the story of Solomon, we see ever so clearly that what God is after, what the Bible teaches us, is not this attempting great things for God, doing great things that will win a name for us. But what God is after is this everyday grinding faithfulness, day after day after day of just being faithful in everything, from front to back, from beginning to end. Faithful. That's what God is after. Not some great thing in the past, not just one part of your life, but faithful in every part of your life. There's another part in the Bible where we get a glimpse of this desire. It's actually in the very last book of the Bible, in the book of Revelation. And when Jesus shows up in that book, he speaks to John this message for the churches. And one of the things that comes through very clearly in the message that Jesus gives for these churches is that he values something that gets called patient endurance and faithfulness. He values the churches and the people who just stick with it time after time, day after day, tomorrow after tomorrow. Author Kevin DeYoung describes this patience or faithful endurance as his dream for the church. He says that we need fewer revolutionaries and more plodding visionaries, a multitude of faithful, risk-taking plodders. The best churches are full of gospel-saturated people, holding tenaciously to a mission of godly obedience and God's glory, and pursuing that godliness and glory with relentless, often unnoticed, plodding consistency. Let me read it to you one more time. Fewer revolutionaries and more plodding visionaries, a multitude of faithful, risk-taking plodders. The best churches are full of gospel-saturated people, holding tenaciously to a mission of godly obedience and God's glory, and pursuing that godliness and glory with relentless, often unnoticed, plodding consistency. That's faithfulness. That's what God is after. Not the occasional great achievement, but the consistency of day after day, tomorrow after tomorrow, faithfulness. The monuments built by doing great things, they're always torn down eventually. But the things that are built by pursuing God's glory with relentless, plodding consistency, these things, they tend to last. And the people who build things with this relentless, plodding consistency that we call faithfulness, they get something better than a statue. They get to hear their master say, well done. So may you be blessed with this relentless, plodding consistency. May you be faithful every day in every corner of your life.